In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at a really important aspect of English that is used all the time within conversation, and that is quantifiers. Now, quantifiers are basically words that indicate the quantity of a noun. They tell us how much of a noun there is. So as you can see, it's probably going to be used often within our speaking. Let's take a look at some examples of these quantifiers. So there are different types of quantifiers depending on the type of noun. Really important to remember. And we'll look at the types of nouns later in this lesson. But we have countable nouns, and these are the quantifiers we use for countable nouns. Few, a few, several, a number of, the majority of, barely any. So if we can count how many nouns, these are the types of quantifiers we use. And I've just picked out some ones that I think are really nice to use. We also have quantifiers for uncountable nouns. Very little, too few, a great deal, much, a large amount of. So if we can't really count the noun, there are some quantifiers we can use. Now there's one other group of quantifiers that we can use for both, either countable or uncountable. And these are phrases like all, plenty of, some, none, least. So there's kind of three different brackets of quantifiers that we can use. And it's all dependent on the type of noun. Are they countable or uncountable? And also there's some quantifiers that we can use for any type of noun, depending on the situation, of course. So let's take a look at countable versus uncountable nouns. So here is some milk. Now, milk is a liquid. I cannot count milk. I can count milk bottles, but liquids, I can't really count it. So it's classed as an uncountable noun. There is very little, the quantifier. There is very little milk left in the fridge. I can't count the amount of milk. Very little is an uncountable quantifier. Let's take a look at a countable quantifier. So here we have some coloured pencils. This is countable. I can see how many there are. So I would have to use a quantifier for countable nouns. Alex bought lots of new pencils. And there is just a quick example. So, in terms of understanding and learning the different countable and uncountable nouns, I can recommend going to Google and simply just searching countable, uncountable noun list. But also, there's a great list of uncountable nouns here from a really solid teacher. Realistically, you just need to learn which nouns are countable and which are uncountable. Now, I'm not suggesting you spend, even if you've got a good idea, another 3 hours, another 4 hours going through and memorizing the list. It's something that you build up fluency in over time. However, a good list that you can look at for 10 minutes every day will, of course, be useful. But here is just a quick shortcut to remembering countable versus uncountable. So countable nouns are for individual people, places, animals, things, or ideas. Uncountable is generally for not individual objects such as feelings, liquids, and mass nouns. For example, transportation. So that's just giving you a bit of a hint there, but the list, of course, will help. So let's jump into a live speaking video, and I'll just pick out a few of my more favoured expressions and give you some examples of their use. Okay, we'll run through a few examples, and of course we're going to begin with some countable nouns. So I'll pick out two of my preferred quantifiers for countable nouns and give you an example. So I need to think of a countable noun first. Employee seems like a great start. Several employees recently quit at work. So several is a really good word to use when giving an amount. So it's more than 2, 3. Several generally means 4, 5, 6. Several employees recently quit at work. Another great expression as a quantifier for countable nouns is barely any. And I just think that this phrase is quite native sounding and a bit more advanced. So definitely worthwhile you practicing with too. Here's an example. There's barely any public holidays left this year. A sad truth. There's barely any public holidays left this year. And of course the noun public holidays is countable. Sadly, I can count public holidays on one hand. There's barely any public holidays left this year. Okay, on to quantifiers of uncountable nouns. And the first uncountable noun I'm thinking of is an emotion, a feeling, and that is fear. So we could say there's a great deal of fear amongst conservation agencies. A great deal, a lot, there's loads. There's a great deal of fear amongst conservation agencies. Great deal. Again, it just sounds a bit more advanced, a bit more native, natural, and definitely would be a great phrase to use for your fluency for a quantifier of uncountable nouns. There's a great deal of fear amongst conservation agencies. Our next uncountable noun is very little, or the quantifier for the uncountable noun, very little. And I'm going to use an example around time, which of course is an uncountable noun. We have very little time left to organise this wedding. Very little time. So a commonly used phrase together, very little time. There's very little time left to organise this wedding or this event. Very little. So when we're looking at quantifiers for both countable and uncountable, I'm going to use the uncountable noun sand. So we can say there's plenty of sand left for production. I can also say there's very little sand left for production. Plenty of, a quantifier for both. Very little, a quantifier for uncountable nouns. So these quantifiers of for both can be used with pretty much any noun, depending slightly on the situation. So definitely use practicing with these quantifiers too. Okay, so that just runs us through some examples of quantifiers in use. And of course, any questions, jump into the Q&A section.